Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
So, hello and warm welcome to our joint session of BDI, the Federation of German Industry, and DGB, the Confederation of the German Trade Unions, closely working together, not only here at COP, but in several respects. My name is Carsten Roller, and I have the pleasure from BDI, pleasure guiding you a little bit through the next 1.5 hours. A session that we called Competitiveness in Transformation, how to turn climate protection into business case, very important part, but as well to increase prosperity and decent jobs. So we try to link really the two success factors of transitions really. How can we really serve as a good example, not only in climate terms, in value terms, but also in social acceptability. And this is, I think, if that would be managed properly, I think then we can really serve as a good example to many others. But is that possible? Is that linked to policy frameworks? What is needed to really fulfill these things? This is what we want to discuss with many experts today. And the two first ones I'd like to call on stage here are Holger Lösch, the Deputy Director General of the BDI, of the Federation of German Industry, and Frederik Moch, the Director of Structural Industry and Service Policy Department at the German Trade Union Confederation. Please, Holger, Frederik, join me on stage.
Yeah, so we decided to organize this as a dialogue, which is something politicians would very much like to see, that labor unions and industry federations are doing a dialogue. So we know each other for quite some time, Frederik. So we spent a lot of hours and nights in the so-called coal commission, phasing out coal in Germany, which was a very interesting experience. And but perhaps I'd like, so we talked about a few questions we might share with each other. So I would start with my first question. So why is a just transition so important for you as labor unions, and what are your ideas how workers could better benefit from this transition, which of course brings a lot of risks and changes?
Yeah, thank you, Holger, and also a warm welcome from my side to all of you. Well, I think trade unions, like businesses, support the modernization of our economy, and it's crucial that we find a common solution, that we go forward. But recognizing the time, we see that we are facing crisis, big challenges, decarbonization, corona pandemic, energy crisis. So lots of things are a bit uncertain, and workers are afraid of what's going on, what will come next, is their workplace safe? And that's why it is important that we work together, that we find common solutions on some, common interests, for example, like the energy costs in Germany. After the energy crisis, the prices went up. We lost capacity in the energy-intensive industries as a basis of the value chain in Germany. And it is really important to find answers how to get along with this situation. And from the trade union's perspective, for sure it's about secure jobs, it's about decent working conditions, and we are strong in the industry because trade unions are organizing industrial companies very well, and this gives us the chance to sit together and to talk on eye level on these things. So I think our German model of a social market based democracy is a good way to make business, and if we have well-organized employers and well-organized trade unions, we find common answers to these challenges. Yeah, I think one crucial point is the question of investment. And Holger, the BDI published a study on the question of investments into the transition of the economy, and also analyzing the location conditions in Germany. So what are the main findings?
Yeah, well, the most important finding is that we really have some work ahead of us. So we had a few very isolated crises over the years. We had, a financial crisis, which is something I would not deride. But we had COVID, very deep crisis, but isolated cause. We had the Ukrainian war. We have the Middle East and a lot of individual crises, but what we see on the industry location is that we have a set of structural issues, not only something happening and then having bad effects on industry or economy or society. So what we see is that we have structural crises, and therefore we said if we don't solve these crises together, we are going to have a huge problem. Being in a very demanding geopolitical time, in a very demanding climate time, acting to reach very ambitious targets. And the key to reach those targets is, of course, to do as many as possible of those millions of investment decisions which have to be taken by individuals, by companies, and by the public hand, and therefore I think we. So it was a bit like Mario Draghi's analysis, and so my feeling is that it raised some eyebrows and perhaps woke up a few people, but. There is a lot to do. So perhaps from my perspective, so as I said, we've been collaborating for many, many years. And so my question would be, what do you think is, in this perspective, working well in Germany? And what would you, as labor unions, change? And of course, what are your expectations for industry, for companies?
Well, I think the first point is that we don't lose trust in a decent future. So we have to look forward and have to analyze the situation. And I think the trade unions in Germany agree in a lot of things the BDE pointed out in that study. So it's about investments, future investments. And I think we have a good basis. We have a well-skilled workforce in Germany. We have a stable democracy. I mean, beside our current situation, it's a stable system. And this gives us the chance, together with innovative companies, together with the knowledge of the workers, to perform very well. But I think some preconditions are not that good. And it's about to tackle the high energy costs. It's about to improve public funding for infrastructure. Our infrastructure is getting worse in Germany, especially when it comes to digitalization. That's not the best performing we have. And from the trade unions perspective, we have to bring this together with social stability, so that people have trust in future and are secured. And for sure, I think 2/3 of the investment volume, that is what you pointed out, must come from the private sector. So it's about the question how we bring the private sector to the point that they invest. And I mentioned the energy costs, but from the trade unions perspective, it needs a clear industrial strategy, how to support businesses to invest in Germany. So it's about reducing the approval times. It's about reliable subsidy scheme. We think, for example, the carbon contracts for differences were very good instruments. So they are targeted and also linked to job security. So I think there are lots of open questions when it comes to a new government, and I think lots of aspects we can bring together into the new coalition, perhaps. Let us go one step forward. So, how can politics support industry to foster the private investments? What's your opinion on that, Holger?
Yeah, I would say, so what industry needs is, of course, confidence. That's important. What we need is sort of reliability of political decisions. So we've seen a lot of in and out of decisions and schemes being implemented and then being withdrawn, or the level of subsidies being raised just months in between months. And so therefore it's the reliability. And I would think that the most important thing is, and I had this panel before here on CBAM, that we really need to get into a more level global playing field. So I'm not a dreamer about a global CO2 price, but having more comparable ambition globally would solve a lot of our problems, because we don't have a problem with prices, but we have a problem with prices our neighbors don't pay, and therefore I think that's something which is very important. Then of course a lot of, I mean, the infrastructure issue is you mentioned it, education, innovation. So there are a lot of fields where it may not cost a lot of money. This is bureaucracy, regulation, and so it's a whole set of things we could imagine which should be changed to make us more able to invest, and of course to keep employment and value creation in Germany high.
Okay, what do you think, what's the role of the BDI, and how can we work together as partners to foster the competitiveness together? So, I mean,
I saw this question and I thought, why should we ask each of us the same question? So that's the question to both of us.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, look, so my understanding is, companies, entrepreneurs, and labor unions in Germany, I think, as a historian and a political scientist, have had a very special relationship, a lot different than in other countries. If I look to our neighboring countries, so this is much more, I would say, controversial, so there are times when labor unions and employers associations are fighting a fight not to the death, but really to the limit. But in the end, I think that the most important thing is that there is a mutual understanding and a deep mutual understanding that a working industry location and an industry or a business or market economy which is really good for companies and good for the employed. So this mutual understanding, I think this is special, and as much difference as we sometimes have in single questions, I think this is the deep understanding that we both have a joint responsibility for keeping this country as we like it.
Yeah, and maybe to follow on this, if the doors are closed, it is also controversial between the employers and the labor unions, but we have no doors, so today it's harmony. This beside, I think you pointed out the right thing, that we have a tradition of finding common solutions on the challenges we are facing, and we are facing a lot of challenges when it comes to the transition, and from the trade unions point, it is also an important part of our role to translate what is done on the political level to the members. So lots of you are experts in these transition issues, and workers at the workplace do not know so well like we do. So it is important that the trade unions try to translate what is happening, talking about the future trends, and bring the workers' voice into this decision-making process. And I think we are organizing this well, and we are finding good answers beside some struggles we also have. But I think that's the role, and it's fine.
So we have the same issue. I can assure you, sometimes it's not easy to explain to entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized companies all aspects of German transformational policy. So we have the same challenge. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Holger.
Thank you, Frederik.
Okay, give him a warm applause. Thank you very much. And in fact, my impression was as well, when you look at all the problems and challenges ahead of us, the analysis was very much the same. So this is a good starting point, also to take the right conclusions. Now, I'd like to sorry, I'd like to call all the panelists now on stage to join me here. If you would come up. No? Sorry. Right. Now, after this joint effort of unions and industry organization, now let me now briefly introduce the panel that is in front of you. To your very left, to your left, there's Dr. Uwe Lauber. Uwe Lauber is the CEO of MAN Energy Solutions, and he is the CEO for almost 10 years. So this is, well, I think quite unusual in Germany, at least not the average, very successful in that. He holds various positions. I can't count all of them, but he's also a member of the National Hydrogen Council of German government. He is highly engaged in the Machinery Industries Association, as he's an engineer himself. And so very glad to have someone from the business perspective really looking into the projects of transition and trying to make money out of that, which was one of the preconditions we looked at. Next to Uwe there is Lavinia Bauerochse. She is the global head of ESG of Corporate Bank of Deutsche Bank. And as such, she's a member of the Corporate Bank Executive Committee, leading the ESG dialogue with big companies, with medium-sized countries of all sizes. So great to have you here as well. Thank you very much. Then there we have from the US, I suppose, David. David Vasco, the Director, International Climate Initiative of the World Resource Institute, which is a huge organization. I learned something like 1,900 employees or so, or all over the world. You're the director of the International Climate Initiative, and as such organizing, for instance, climate justice dialogues. So there's the link to our today's topic. And you bring in experience from NGOs as well. You've worked with Oxfam for quite a while. You've worked with the Friends of the Earth. So you're on both sides, or several sides, scientific side, NGO side, and bring in other perspectives that we are very happy with. Last, but by far not least, is by Boitu Milo Molete. I'm sorry, I have to still practice a bit. Ms. Molete is with the Labour Federation COSATU in South Africa, and there she's responsible for the social development policy as a coordinator there. South Africa, of course, in several respects, very interesting, and we will come back to that today, as South Africa is also one of the first countries that actually agreed in this Just Energy Transition Partnerships, these JETPs as they're called. And I guess you also made several interesting experiences when it comes to really how to balance that out. What could be the union's role in achieving social justice in this transition, and how can we really make sure that no one is left behind in this process. So great that you're here. Now we start maybe Uwe with the business side, looking into the energy transition with all its challenges, with all its chances. If you look in your own business, do you see a lot of chances in terms of profitability there, or is that more a glass half empty at this stage? Is there a lot to do when it comes to regulatory framework conditions? So do you see the perspective also for a country like Germany and a company like MAN, that this transition in the end will bring new business models that we can live on?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And you mentioned I'm since 10 years as a CEO. I consider myself not a dinosaur. So why am I in this position? Because I think innovation drives the company. Without innovation, no future, that's quite clear. Good news here, and this is not only valid for my company as MAN Energy Solutions, but also for others. We have the technology to drive decarbonization. We and German companies have the technology, and this is really necessary. And having technology means, of course, also that we have the opportunity to make money out of it. We all need to do that, which means we need to decarbonize our world. There's no other way than to do that and to go this way. But at the same time, as a leader of a company, we need to earn money. So there is a huge potential also for us. Just an example, we changed our name a couple of years ago from MAN Diesel and Turbo to MAN Energy Solutions. It's not only because it was on vogue to change the names. A lot of companies are doing that. But we had a new strategy. My management team and I, we thought, what is the future of our company as being a traditional engineering-driven company producing engines, diesel engines, which are not nice in terms of emissions, of course. And what is the future? So Rudolf Diesel has invented the first engine in our company. So our obligation, of course, is and was to drive that further on. So make a Rudolf Diesel 2.0 out of the company. And with our brain, with our technology, we thought, what is our contribution in terms of decarbonization? So I said the technology is there. We have electrolyzers these days in our portfolio because we need green hydrogen in massive volume to decarbonize certain sectors. Energy transition means also heat transition because 2/3 of the energy will be converted to heat. So we have also heat pumps today in our portfolio based on our turbo machinery equipment. And of course, global trade is still a valid point. So here the topic is using our engines which are capable to run on alternative fuels like ammonia, methanol, or synthetic methane. So you see, technology is available, and these are good news. Now the question is, how can we make business also in Germany? And we are in competition with the outside world, looking at the United States or looking at China. We are I would say, in a kind of a sandwich position. I've been in the United States last week. And having had the chance to talk to industry leaders like the Carnival Group, Disney, and also the Municipal of Boston, they just do it. And this is what we are lacking here in Europe. The pragmatic way of the Americans, maybe combined with our technology, that would make us really, really strong, also against of the Chinese. So let's do the extra mile and go for it and be a little bit more pragmatic, stand up and be proud and have the can-do mentality. That is what I would like to see here in Europe.
Thank you. Just one question on the uncertainty, because we have heard from Holger at the beginning certainty and trust in a certain pathway are key. You're building now these engines that could run on e-fuels, but you don't produce, of course, the e-fuel itself. So you somehow depend on others in this evolving market. What's the key uncertainty in all of your business plans and how you deal with it in your dialogue with financial sectors and others?
I mean, investments for, building a huge, let's say, container vessel costs these days 150 million euros. So the operator has to be sure what kind of propulsion technology he's going to use, because he has to live with it for the next 25 or even 30 years or 35 years. So the necessity to choose the right technology is very important. We, as a supplier of these engines, we have built the engine in a very smart way, which means flexibility. It's flexible. You can choose an engine which is dual fuel capable, means you still can run the engine with the existing fuel today, with diesel, so to say, and once the alternative fuel is available, you can also switch over. So flexibility and investment security is really the driver of our client. So we have to have both. Otherwise, he would never ever invest in a technology where he has a lot of insecurity and maybe disappears in 2 or 3 years from now.
Right. Thank you. Now, there's a lot of investment that is involved in this transition, and BDI has done its study in September, coming up with a figure of 1.4 trillion euro that have to be invested up to 2030, not only for climate change, but for all of the transitions, digital transformation and all of that. But still, it is a huge number. And that has to be financed somehow. And here we are with Lavinia Bauachse. Is that possible? Is financing a bottleneck of this transition? Or do you see the bottlenecks more on the profitability of the project on other sides?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. The numbers are vast. Everybody agrees on that. And I don't think it will take a single sector who can really mobilize such volumes of capital. But the good news is I don't see actually the so-called scarcity of capital. Of course, it's a different conversation. Sorry? Yeah, it's back again. It's a different conversation of what sources of capital we are talking about, but I can absolutely, from my observation, say there is a hunt for green assets. So there is a lot of capital actually which is in competition, and this is good elements to it but also bad elements to it. So it will be required that we are really focused on spending each euro or dollar wisely. It has to create the biggest impact. And it also should be leveraged or used to create leverage so that money spent creates more capital to flow. But actually, when it comes to the profitability of projects, that's really the hard focus we need for some time. So I'm not too positive that we should spend or invest into projects which are not economically feasible unless there is a strategic value for the future. So those might be the exceptions, but otherwise there is competition around capital to be deployed, and that means that there are certain return expectations. Those return expectations are really also driven by the risks associated. So there are differences between the established renewable areas where the market understands the risks associated and how to mitigate those risks. Everybody knows how to finance renewables like solar or wind. It is a different picture if you have technologies which are not yet in scale deployed or produced. So those are differences also from a risk perspective, and those projects might be still very, very worthwhile to invest for future competitiveness and strategic value, but they will require some support. So overall, it needs to have a differentiated view on what we are looking at.
Just another question, as we're talking that much here at COP about this new collective quantified goal on climate finance for developing countries. Whatever the figure will be in the end, nobody knows at this stage, and whether it will come up with a figure. Do you think this is one of the key and will become one of the key drivers also for investment in developing countries, or is that just the last piece in the puzzle, and there are a lot more elements that are crucial to help also developing countries financing their transitions? I mean, we're talking about blended capital, we're talking about leveraging. So is it all dependent on state money, or are there a lot more elements to think of?
It's a crucial piece, but it's not the sole silver bullet, I would say. That amount is very important actually to get the funding in place after the commitments we have seen. That's the biggest struggle at the moment. But still, in deploying the money which is going to flow, there are some lessons to be learned. So beyond solely that amount or these funds to be created, we really need to have more coordination amongst the different stakeholders. We need capacity building and capability building locally also to bring projects to future advances in their financing. So those lessons learned can be also looked into in parallel. What I mentioned with the profitability profile, I think it's very important to create investor security. Investors are very shy if there are risks unpredictable to them. So the more they have planning security, that the frameworks are constant, that they know how to deploy their money for a long-term perspective, the more likely it gets to see not only those funds coming, but also investors entering these projects. So that's the whole security element I was trying to employ too.
So it's all about de-risking the huge investment by regulation, by quotas and guarantees and whatever.
I would love to add one thing, because I think we are always getting very negative if we come to that discussion. We see vast projects now coming to market, reaching those financing stages. Those prominent projects are really a template for maybe less prominent projects to follow suit. Because if we are talking, for example, about hydrogen, we as Deutsche Bank were engaged in H2 Green Steel, which is a greenfield steel production site in Sweden. Yes, it's not the developing countries, but it had a huge and complex capital structure deployed to it. And those projects are actually creating templates which can be replicated. So it has a benefit for other projects to follow, which might not have the same size, but still they will benefit from such projects to come to market.
I will come back to the lead market probably in the end with Mrs. Baron then organizing these lead markets somehow. David, now with the World Resources Institute having really a very broad overview around the globe of many transitions, successful ones and less so, what do you think are the key success factors of really balancing out these transitions in a socially acceptable way? I mean, there's so many different cultures, there are different instruments that are made use of. Is there any very good example that you could give us, or any advice from comparing all these countries?
Well, I think there are a number of dimensions that need to be taken into account, and thinking about how to go about the transition in ways that are smooth, if you will, although the road is always bumpy, from the point of view of communities and workers and the broader public and polity, if you will. I think we've often focused on workers as a key question in thinking about that transition, and that's absolutely critical. But one of the things we've really begun to see is that it's also important to look at the community and broader contexts. And for example, we know that when there are transitions away from, for example, coal mining, or in the case of oil and gas, away from that production, the ripple effects are not limited just to workers. They go out beyond to communities. And what's critical then is to look at that community economic impact and think about how to diversify economies. That's true at the national level and the sub-national government level as well. And for example, we've been looking at oil and gas, and one of the key questions there that I don't think we've really collectively fully absorbed yet is the importance of revenues for those governments and how to go about addressing what their revenue loss may look like, and as a consequence, what economic diversification, what taxation strategies, and so forth will need to be put in place.
If it is not only the workers, and of course there are workers that highly depend on the way a structural change of their branches is managed, to what extent they can really profit from educational offers and really having a chance to transform themselves as well. There are other groups that are at the center of this transition. I think of poorer pensioners paying their heating bill at the end. I think of highly energy intensive companies in an international competition. I think of countryside versus big cities, as this energy transition is probably more challenging in the countryside if you move and have to go long distances. Where do you see also a different spin in organizing these social justice elements in the transition next to the workers' educational part?
Well, I think the key factor in many ways is proactive planning that's done through multi-stakeholder dialogue, really bringing the full set of stakeholders, business, workers, communities, et cetera, together to do the planning that's needed. I also would point to ways in which I think we can look on the upside of the transition. And for example, in the United States with the IRA legislation that many of you are probably familiar with, there were a series of tax credits for some of them existing but continued wind and solar tax credits, for example, but also new ones, electric vehicles to a greater degree than in the past, and a number of other tax credits, which in fact has delivered $500 billion in investment over the last 2 years, which is a 71% increase from the 2 years preceding that. So it really has had a big impact. Now, as part of that, there's also been a drive to make sure that a lot of those investments go to low-income and marginal communities. And so it's not just a question of addressing the negative harms that might come, but also how can you take those investments and put them into the kind of communities that need them most. And there's over $10 billion in the IRA legislation specifically aimed at taking that path.
We'll come back to the IRA in a minute, but let us include Boitumilu at this point. From South Africa, and I just mentioned at the beginning that South Africa is one of the first countries. A JETP, a Just Energy Transition Partnership, has been established. Now, is it 2 years or so running, more or less? And you, I think, very close to this in terms of projects, in terms of what is what is really the justice element that is meant to, next to phasing out coal, of course, on the climate side. What's your take? Is that a successful approach to really balance out energy transitions?
I think just to give an indication that even in JETPs, it's very important that we understand the role of trade unions and workers in the discussion. When it comes to the South African JETP, one of the first elements I think that was neglected in the beginning was the actual inclusivity of workers in the discussion. So with that lack, it was important going forward for the South African government to further incorporate the voice of workers in the discussion, getting workers on the table. And I think one important principle of the JETPs in South Africa and how it's currently being administered is the importance of social dialogue. And I think, like the colleague has said over here, David, it's not only about workers, and we are aware as the trade union movement because workers are also community members. Workers leave their employment and get into these communities that actually require economic diversification. They get into these communities where actually they are impacted by the various climate adversities that are faced. So we are not only speaking towards the protection of jobs and social security in relation to employment, but also in relation to the fact that workers are parts of these communities, and we need to have communities and people that are able to live in a sustainable, reliable community and environment. So beyond just protecting workers, we need to be protecting the environments, and we need to be making sure that there's adequate attention given to those requirements to ensure that workers are able to function in a low carbon economy, and workers are able to contribute to a low carbon economy in a way that is beneficial, whether it's through the investment in reskilling, whether it's the investment in education, whether it's investment in upskilling. So it's a holistic a process that we need to look at, in that we don't need to just hollow out the participation of workers only by us selling our labor to business. It's beyond just us selling our labor. The worker needs to be looked at in a very holistic manner so that we understand how it is we can respond differently to climate adversities.
Okay, so I understand it is a lot more than just giving education, making transparent the necessity of really transforming in these dialogue fora that you're organizing. And next to that, establishing a social infrastructure that maybe in former times churches have done, and now the state and other institutions come in to offer services. If you have good examples to other JETPs or other countries, I know there's a couple of them, Vietnam, Senegal and so forth, what would be your learnings now from these first 2 years that you'd like to hand over to make not the same mistakes that you may have made at the beginning, or share the first learnings?
It's very interesting because we had a dialogue with the Senegalese trade union movement in South Africa recently, just about the learnings of our JP and how we would want them to look out for various parts in which we were blindsided. And the first, in fact, was to ensure that they are at the table. That they are not left behind in the discussions of government, because it's very easy for government to make international declarations and commitments without actually considering the work base, and that's a bit odd, because we believe that workers should be at the forefront of the discussions on just transition, of the discussions of JETPs and climate finance. So the most significant thing is to ensure that you're at the table and understanding what it is that these commitments are about. What South Africa has put very much forward is how we wanted less loans and more grants, and we're giving to the rest of the countries that are going to be coming into these JETPs to guard against actually being further indebted. Because if you do look at the current climate finance mechanisms, I mean, they are dollar denominated. And from a global south country, having loans that are imposed through JETPs that are dollar denominated, and most likely your country would not be able to pay at a pace that is adequate, should be something you guard against. Another part is that, I mean, the transition needs to be something that is spoken of across the board through social partners, and we've seen in South Africa how the Presidential Climate Commission is an actual mechanism that has assisted us to have dialogue from business to government to communities, faith-based organizations, trade unions, and young people. So that is very important, to have a legislated body that is able to facilitate those discussions at that level so that they are able to be fast-tracked. Another part is that the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa was key to establishing a national framework of what a just transition should look like. So a South African just transition was actually drafted through the Presidential Climate Commission, and I think that's a very good example that we would want to give, in that having these discussions legislated and profiled at the national level is going to allow for the discussion to fast track and allow for adequate engagement. But also, I mean, not a lot of trade unions especially have their thumbs on the finance discussion. And it's important that countries are actually able to have a more consolidated approach when it comes to discussing climate finance and what it means for their economies and what type of finance is required to finance the transition in their respective countries.
So it's not only about the amount of money, but it's really also the way of how it is spent on the social side. But very similar would hold also for the competitiveness side. If we look at the IRA that you mentioned, David, it is a completely different approach of how the money is actually injected into the green transition. And Uwe, maybe as you're also with your company in many markets, where do you see the key chances or differences between the European approach and the US way of injecting public money to increase investment via the IRA?
I think, first of all, we need to understand when are we successful? What are the driving factors? And you talk quite a lot about financing, so money. Money, that's very important. Then there needs to be a good cooperation between the politicians, the government, and the economy, the industry. And I think looking at the IRA, there's specifically a strong link between industry and the politicians. Politicians set the framework that the industry can work on. I said right at the beginning, we have the technology. These are good news. I think also there's not a mismatch between politicians and us, but we are not the fastest, so to say. We need to speed up certain things. And I give you one simple example out of our company. We built up an electrolyzer company in the north part of Germany, nearby Hamburg. It took us 1.5 years to get the permit. 1.5 years. It's unbelievable for me. It's unbelievable. That's by far too long. China and the United States are faster. That's what I call the just do mentality. I'm not saying that we should do it in the same way, but we should be really faster and a little bit, not like the cowboys, sorry to say, David, but a little bit more progressive in what we are doing is needed. And then it comes to the point financing. I mean, you said correctly, I'm part of the National Hydrogen Council. The money is there. We had nearly 9 billion euro, but we were not in a position to spend it. Why is that? So these three elements are not working correctly or in an optimized way in Europe. We are doing better than we have done in the past, but we need to speed up. And the chances are there because I clearly said technology and innovation is the driver. If we manage to work closer as a team, teamwork is our superpower and can be our superpower, we can be much better than China and the United States, and then we will escape from what I call the sandwich position.
Let's jump over on the other side of the Atlantic to David. What was you on IRA? Is that really the successful driver of energy transition in the US, and will it stay? Question mark. With the new framework conditions, the political ones that are in front of us. So is that really something also US business has taken up and is highly convinced of? Or was that more a political idea that may come and go?
A broad-based base of support, in fact, for what was in the IRA. That's not to say that there may not be political wrinkles in the next year or so. But when you look at the extent of investment, as I mentioned, 500 billion in total investment in clean energy in the U.S. in the last couple of years, you see the degree to which it's really shifted the investment climate. In addition to some of the very technology-specific tax credits, there are also technology-neutral tax credits for clean energy production and investment. And that's been something that I think the business community, I think this echoes a point that was made earlier, has been very receptive to and appreciative of, that there are opportunities to pursue a whole gamut of clean energy technologies and also reap the benefits of the tax credits. The tax credits are also long-term, and that's been a key incentive from the point of view of business as well. The last thing that I think is quite critical and politically important is that a majority of the investments that are due to the IRA have been in Republican-held congressional districts. So the money is flowing into states in the U.S. South, for example, where there has been a boom, truly a boom, in new battery manufacturing and electric vehicle manufacturing. And so that has, I think, changed the landscape in terms of interests and political interests in particular for this. And I think that will have an effect going forward. The other thing is that it has also, while it's supported business, has in fact also supported workers. And there's an estimated 9 million jobs that would be created over the next decade from the IRA. That brings us to our political predicament. And I think that there will be a push, unfortunately, in Congress to try to strip away some of these tax credits and other elements of the IRA. But again, there are congressional districts that have benefited enormously, who are, the representatives there are Republicans and have some interest, I think, some direct interest in their community, in fact, in not getting rid of the tax credit. So we'll have to see over the coming months how that plays out.
Understand. Some mixed picture on well, what will stay and what will go out of the IRA in the next years. Public finance is one element, one pillar, of course, of this transition. But we try, of course, to be not only to build the whole transition not only on public spending, because subsidies come and go, and we know that public households change year by year. So this is just a volatile basis to build an investment upon. Another way, and this is one of the key topics of this COP, is of course building other streams of revenue and other financing schemes. And Article 6 and the carbon markets is of course one of them that we talk so much about. And there's a lot of hope in building this, also in helping developing countries to find ways next to this public way of NCGQG to really get approach to public money and private money, particularly in Western Germany, in Western Europe, in the US. Do you see already investors preparing for that, Lavinia? So even if the Article 6 is not fully accomplished, this is part of these negotiations. Are there already partners that build business models and plan with it, or is that far away in the future?
No, we can be ensured that the market is carefully monitoring what's happening and very prepared to act upon whatever we are agreeing here. Maybe just, we touched earlier on some of the examples we are part of and we've seen in, for example, Sweden, but there are as prominent projects also in the global south or in the developing countries. What we need to bear in mind is that we have a different profile there of capital, when capital should be deployed, because we do have more complexity to deal with, also more risks to bear in mind. So maybe there's a different perception of what the return expectations are. And if we wouldn't disclose that, we just wouldn't see one of the elephants in the room. So I think we need to deal with that and address it. One of the initiatives from the German government, both the MNZ and also the BMWK, is the Green Guarantee Group, which is bringing currently together large expert group, which I'm also part of, to look into what could guarantees play a role in scaling up private capital. Also with the same consideration in mind that a guarantee can help take out risks which otherwise would make a project not bankable, that it should be used in order to leverage additional capital to be deployed. And one of the target areas with a quite wide scope of technologies being looked at, but the target areas are the emerging and developing countries. So overall, I think we have a lot of instruments. It requires potentially more coordination of the stakeholders, which we need in order to create the capital structures to make those projects bankable and bring them to market. So coordination, even with the role of MDBs, with DFIs, with private sector, that would be definitely useful. And I've touched earlier already that we do see that those projects, there could be use for also more capacity and capability building. Because, for example, with the case of guarantees, there will be more reporting requirements be attached. And we do, as long as we don't scrap all the bureaucracy burden, I would be also a huge fan of that, I have to admit. But being realistic, there will be also a lot of bureaucracy needed for those deal teams, those project teams to actually get the guarantees in place, to ensure the reporting is in place. So we need to ensure that those capacity building is being taken care of at the same time.
Absolutely, and I'm sure there will be a consensus on a simplification act when it comes to the reporting very easily here on stage. Again, on the other side, on the receptive side of those revenue streams that Article 6 and an instrument like this could produce, Botemelu, are partners, are actors in South Africa that you are aware of building already plans, investment plans on such an instrument? Or again, is that a vision that is by far too far away from today to already start off with doing concrete project work and preparing it?
South Africa is actually well advanced in trying to implement their objectives when it comes to the JPs and the climate finance that we've received. We have what we have now established, the Just Energy Transition funding platform, where all of the funding that's channeled through South Africa is actually facilitated through that funding platform, which is handled by the project management unit at the level of the presidency. So there are mechanisms to try to filter down finance down to grassroots projects so that they're able to invest in their efforts to create just transition projects. This was launched quite recently, and we're able to do that through the PMU in regions like Mpumalanga that are very coal intensive. So we are at the beginning phases of ensuring that financing is actually channeled through grassroots projects, including trade unions. The call is quite open to allow for all of those people that are going to be able to influence and have projects that are pushing for just transition in South Africa to be put online. So we are at the beginning phases of that, and we're looking forward to that participation. And I think also just to indicate that it's very much a collective effort. The National Business Institute of South Africa is involved, the trade unions are involved, and so is the presidency. So we're just implementing at that level.
Another element that could help, of course, to increase the profitability of green technologies all over the world is carbon pricing. I mean, this is, of course, to me, the first step and the key element, actually, that we're talking about so long. With schemes like JETPs, like other schemes that try to balance out the redistributional effects that might come with a carbon price. Do you see rising acceptance of carbon pricing? Is there a debate on that in South Africa that you take part in, that you promote somehow? Or is there a lot of fear of being somehow one of the losers of the transition, being exposed to a high carbon price?
At this stage, there is debate on carbon pricing, carbon border adjustments, and the honest, on-the-ground reflections is that there is a lot of fear in relation to what this means to the transition, in relation to whether or not this will impede us from actually transitioning adequately, noting that we're very much a developing country. So the discussions are taking place. We're still analyzing. We're still getting various professionals to assist us to actually understand what this broadly means for the average South African and the transition in South Africa. I think DGB is one of the federations that with the ITUC are very helpful in terms of us having these reflections, and I think going forward we should be able to have these discussions as well internally as the trade union movement. But it is something currently that's very scary for Africa, very scary for South Africa, and we're hoping through our engagements we'll be able to see if this is going to be helpful for our transition, or if this is going to be, like some are fearing, another oppressive measure for the global South to be unable to transition.
And it highly depends, of course, on what you do with the revenues out of these carbon pricing elements, whether you would give them back somehow as a lump sum or so to the population to balance out the fears and compensate for that, or what else is done. David, with your global view, maybe just a brief overview on where else do you see reactions, whether it is on CBAM, why countries may think now of implementing carbon pricing as one of the elements that also could finance, of course, in the end, all of what we discussed about the green transition.
Yeah.
Is that now increasing? Is that helping?
Well, I think we're facing paradoxes when it comes to the transition and how this is playing out in terms of trade and international economic dynamics. I think in large measure, some of that has to do with the fact that while in the past we argued about who should stop doing the bad stuff, and that's still a key question, we're also now arguing about who gets to do the good stuff. And so we have industrial policy. Arguably, China really in the green space was the front runner on that. The US now with the IRA, Europe is also coming into that space, and other countries too undoubtedly will. What that is doing, though, is creating a tension, perhaps, between national efforts to build a green economy and what's needed for international economic cooperation. So, for example, with the U.S., the IRA has some restrictions on the circumstances in which the tax credits can be used. There has to be a certain amount of U.S.-based production for a number of the products, goods that receive the tax credits. The question, I think, is when does that make sense and when not? So, for example, and this is speaking very personally, I think that electric vehicles are a domain in which a lot of countries have an interest in maintaining their industry. On the other hand, I think that solar panels are something where countries that currently aren't producing them at large scale are going to have a very hard time coming into a market that's very heavily dominated by China. And it's not clear to me it makes sense to think about industrial policy for solar panels per se if you want to have the kind of renewable energy transition at pace that we need. So I think it really can get quite nuanced in terms of where it makes sense and not. With CBAM, I think similarly we have to really look carefully at what the impacts are going to be and the benefits, what the benefits are going to be. So, for example, I think it's important to think about with steel, to take that example, which countries, in fact, that are exporting steel to Europe are going to feel the economic pinch. And I would argue that it's not necessarily China that will feel the economic pinch, even though much of the rhetoric has been about China. It may be other countries. On the other hand, China may feel the pinch, and I think the US even may feel the pinch from CBAM when it comes to petrochemicals. And so I think we need to really tease these things apart and think about exactly what we're aiming to do and where it makes sense to pursue these kind of national policies that are mercantile in a sense, and when, in fact, doing so might get in the way of the green transition.
And it is meant, in fact, to really create a level playing field rather than having national carbon prices that distort somehow the markets. Now, it would be your turn, if you like, to raise questions, add comments, whatever is in your mind to what you've heard already. Please raise your hand. I think there is a mic on the left, and there's the first hand on the very... Oh yeah, two hands. Okay.
Hi there. Well, my question is for David, just on your comments about the IRA. You mentioned the sort of this notion that huge amounts of investment from the IRA are going into red states, and perhaps that will insulate the IRA. I can't help but think that, right, those same constituencies are still the ones who voted to put the Republicans in office. And so I just wondered if I could get your thoughts, I guess, on that, and then also to suggest, is this partly the people who are working in battery, manufacturing? Perhaps these are sort of, those sound like highly educated people to me, which we kind of generally, we know that, or on average at least, increasingly the sort of the right-wing supporters is banking on working class voters. So I guess my question is, what do you sort of make of the continued support for candidates who are really anti-IRA in these counties? And is it potentially that even though we're targeting the right counties, we're not actually targeting the right voters within those counties? That's what I'm...
Like to act immediately?
I think it's a very fair question. I think how the politics interplays with the subsidies and the benefits coming from the legislation is a complicated dynamic. Just one thing at the outset, I don't think climate and related issues were on the ballot at all in this past election. And so I don't think we saw these as relevant questions, salient questions in the context of the election. And I think that was true across the board for voters. And there was very little said about the IRA in the course of the election. I agree that there needs to be real thought given to which voters are the ones who are benefiting most from this, and how does one engage with those voters who, for instance, may be working in electric vehicle manufacturing or battery manufacturing or what have you. I think an important test is going to come in this next session of Congress, when there's no question there will be a push from a number of quarters, and maybe not even principally from the Trump administration, to roll back some of those subsidies and tax credits. And I think that's when the test will come, whether some of these members of Congress see that losing those investments that are either there now or maybe coming would be too detrimental for them politically, and they don't go along. And remember, the Republicans in the House of Representatives will have, a 4-seat margin or something along those lines. And so the margins are very narrow when it comes to actually getting something passed.
There's another question here.
Good afternoon. Andrew Hobbs from EY. Thanks for a really interesting panel. I have a question for Lavinia, and it's on the question of business case. I was really encouraged by your remarks that scarcity of capital isn't a problem, that there's a hunt for green assets. And you talked about 2 categories of investment. One was where the financial business case is made, the profitability is there, and the other was about, well, the asset is of strategic importance anyway. Be really interested to know what you're not getting from companies or projects in either of those buckets that you'd like to see more of in terms of information, forward-looking information, that sort of thing.
Thank you for that question. I wouldn't say we are not seeing enough of either. what we are observing at the moment is two things. So I think there will be for a certain time still the need, because capacities are scarce, and capacities, for example, in the project finance space is just simply, there's a lot of effort being put into due diligence and sorting out the contracts, understanding, discussing the risk mitigation across all stakeholders. I think that drives the need for some time to also look at larger scale projects or a certain size of project, because otherwise it's not going to be feasible to really have these due diligences done on smaller scale projects. That's one part. And the other one is really that we need to think about driving up demand and supply at the same time. So there is some conservatism at the moment with regards to long-term off-takes in technologies which are not yet profitable, where potential off-takers don't feel at the moment they have the security to commit to long-term off-take agreements and prices they are locked in. So that's the area I've mentioned where we need to have a strategic perspective how to invest and scale both supply and demand at the same time up, because that's where the market needs to get together, and that's in our economical interest in order to create supplies and in particular in the hard-to-abate industries.
You like to add on that, Uwe, on the bringing together supply and demand?
Yeah, large-scale plants, and this is the most important point. I mean, we have a lot of pilot projects in order to demonstrate that the technology is there, but the end product, let's see hydrogen production for instance, is the price is too high, and we only get the prices down if we scale up our production facilities. So it's always the question what comes first. Today, the biggest plant in the world might be 50 megawatt. There are some projects in discussions which might come, which might not come. I don't know it. But if we really believe in decarbonization, we definitely need hydrogen as a basis of alternative fuels. And let's take the example of the maritime industry. We need to replace 300 million tons of heavy fuel oil. That means 120 million tons of hydrogen is needed. But we also need, and we should not forget it, and that brings me to the point of CO2, we need also CO2 as a product. So for methanol, for instance, we need as well 850,000 tons. So CO2 is going to be a product. So this is a very, very complicated topic. But as long as we do not invest in large-scale production facilities, the prices and the costs will not go down. And again, to the maritime industry, look, these large container vessels, and I just have had the chance last week or the week before to attend the naming ceremony of a large container vessel in Hamburg. 23,600 containers on it. Imagine. They transport goods from Asia to Europe. A T-shirt, for instance. The price of the T-shirt might be changed by using methanol, green methanol, by 1 cent or half a cent. This can be used as an upscaling industry. So there are business cases, and I think everybody agrees in this room that you are in a position to pay 1 cent more for your T-shirt, right? So the maritime industry can be the, let's say, accelerator for this hydrogen production, but we need large plants.
That was an important point on green lead markets and how we establish these lead markets by building all the certification and everything that is around that. Lavinia.
I would love to make one additional comment because you touched on it as well. What we love to look into, and the ideal scenario is really to first start off with integrated projects where the whole ecosystem and supply chain has been established and come together, but also the off-taker or the industrial client who actually deploys later is right from the start part of a project consideration. And that's really driving the speed of bringing that project together, and is ideally also taking out some of the risks, for example, like transport by near site production. Those elements can be addressed, and those projects then help other projects to follow.
Take away the market risk at least, yeah, from the very beginning. I saw a last question to close, a brief one.
I'll try. Gregor Salle, GIZ. You discussed a lot about carbon pricing. I just want to point out, we know that carbon pricing, if done right, works. So I think it's absolutely essential to support countries in implementing carbon pricing policies and instruments, but that is easier said than done. There are a lot of issues with acceptability, capacities, coordination, etc. And there is a systemic issue with the CBAM, which basically would demand the same carbon prices be paid in the country of origin than in the EU, which is not really possible for countries like Mozambique, etc. So I would be interested to hear your perspective on that.
We tried, maybe David tried to answer already a little bit on why is there so much fear in implementing carbon pricing, and what could be success factors in balancing out the effects.
Yeah, I think the question of how carbon pricing plays out is very context dependent. And before saying something about the international dynamics, just to give the US as an example, carbon pricing has largely, not entirely, failed as a political matter in the United States, which is why the IRA went toward tax credits as the policy approach. There are some states that are an exception, but I think that's so far, hopefully that will change, but so far that's been the case, and lots of political economy theories about why. I think in an international context, as I was saying, I think it's really important to look at where the effects are going to be felt and what the dynamics are. So Mozambique will, with aluminum, will feel the effects of CBAM in a way that probably is not even intended by the constructors of CBAM. And so there's been discussion of how the EU might recycle revenue from the CBAM to go to developing countries to support their transition. But just going back to my earlier point, I think we really need to tease out what the specific impacts are going to be and how this is going to benefit the climate, and also what the needs are, the necessities, I guess you could say, for domestic industry that it's meant to meet. And I don't know that there was an intent with CBAM to most affect, let's say, Turkey perhaps, but certainly not Mozambique. I think a lot was aimed at China. And as I said, where China feels the pinch is going to be an important question. And I don't know that those who designed CBAM were thinking that it would have a marginal effect on Chinese steelmaking. So I think we really do need to think these things through. And one of the reasons is we've seen here quite a storm about unilateral trade measures. And what that means is that international cooperation, collaboration becomes more difficult when you pursue these kind of measures. And as a result, if you are going to pursue them, I think one has to really know what are the benefits, what are those climate benefits.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure we will see next year with the new NDCs what countries will take up the carbon pricing idea, who might join the Green Climate Club with some 29 already signed, promoting this idea. Thank you very much to all the 4 panelists, and give them a warm applause. Now, I'd like to call on stage Dr. Beate Baron, Holger Lösch, and Frederik Moch again. Maybe as you just joined and couldn't get all of the discussion at the very beginning, Holger and Frederik tried to find some sort of starting point where we are at the moment, and there was a lot of consensus. There was not really a merger of DGB but BDI, but there's a lot of similar views and perspectives of where we start off. But with what you've heard maybe at the end, or what you've wished to hear, where do we stand when it comes to bringing together social dimension and the competitiveness and the profitability of the projects in whatever you do as not a regulator, but the government, giving and setting the framework around what is your take? What has to be done and what can be done by government?
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me here at this event. I'm pleased to be here. I mean, of course, we have a challenging pathway. A pathway towards climate neutrality is really a challenge. And we need to work together. The challenge is simply too big that one can do it on its own bill, but we really need to work together. And I think there's consensus that the decisive phase is now for investments. And of course, we have to make sure that we look on the business side, and the relevant question, is there a business case for pathing towards climate neutrality? Then we have as well that we are well aware of the social dimension as well. And this is a bit of the challenge, but I still do think that the answer is cooperation and international cooperation. To make, we just had an event on green lead markets to make sure that we have global demand and that we can ensure that there are global markets. And obviously for global markets, we need global cooperation.
Right. Now, you're the new director industrial policy of Ministry of Economic Affairs, and in fact moving from subsidies to green markets is key. And if you look at the instruments that are already on the table, we have climate contracts as sort of subsidy scheme, we have carbon pricing. Is there any element missing to you that you would wish the next government maybe to implement, or are we complete and now just have to see the whole development going?
Probably we are never complete, and probably it's always a learning process. So, and we have to understand it as a process. I think this is really crucial. I think we have to be clear about goals and commitment. I think it's really essential for business that we are clear about goals and that we are clear about commitment. And then, of course, we need clear regulatory frameworks. We have in the EU emission trading scheme, which is, of course, good and essential that we have it, but we need different clear regulatory frameworks. And one we try to develop in Germany is probably on CCS, where we clearly are behind our neighbors and other countries, so we need, I think, clarity here. And you mentioned it, we need to develop our tools. It will only be a mix, it will only be a toolbox, it's not the one and only instrument, so we need instruments to support investments. I think that the Contracts for Difference idea is a good one and one that can work, but of course we need to learn. And at the end then, of course, the demand side. This is something that is missing at the moment, and we need to develop the demand side.
Frederik, we've also tried to discuss and touch upon the different dimensions of what is socially inclusive, and we learned South Africa has very different challenges probably compared to us. But what was your main take from the discussion we had with all the experts here on how can we organize a socially inclusive energy transition from a trade union's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, lots of important aspects were mentioned, and let me point out two dimensions of this social aspects. The first one, as a trade unionist, it's the question of job security, of workplaces, of decent working conditions when it comes to the transition. And because Beate Baron mentioned the carbon contracts for differences, they have a link also to the job security. This is what we are promoting. And the second dimension is the dimension of the distributional costs. So we have to recognize if there are distributional effects, for example, when it comes to carbon pricing, which have social impacts to society, to companies, to smaller and bigger companies, and so on. And that's why we have to think about these impacts when it comes to the policy-making process. And I think it is necessary, and would also like to underline what was said before, that the one hand is pushing, but the other side is also to have an attractive supporting scheme so that we attract private investments into the targeted fields of the transition.
Now, competitiveness is key. That was also part of the discussion, and the energy transition is challenging, but there are additional elements that came up with the US election, with a new trade environment maybe for the future, with customs being raised vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis China. Where do you see the biggest challenges, Holger, for German industry also on this pathway in front of us?
Yeah, I could imagine that if some of the aspects we've seen from Donald Trump's campaigning and people close to him talking, I mean, if it comes to sort of a backlash on climate policy globally, e.g. United States going out of the Paris Treaty or even leaving the UNFCCC. This could, of course, change the situation, and but the much higher risk is, of course, very disruptional potential if he's implementing tariffs. And I would say this is the most dangerous consequence which could come from this election, and I'm quite sure that this would need a wholly different approach than how we can talk about competitiveness, and but this is something which we really have to closely coordinate with Europe, with the EU Commission. But this would, from my perspective, be the biggest challenge. I mean, if it comes a little less bad, to say it like this, it still stays a problem that we will see a non-existing global level playing field, especially with the United States, but as well with China and India and other partners. And so the challenge is to keep our targets and stay competitive. These targets will not go away anytime soon.
The whole idea of energy transitions, as we discussed them, is about collaboration. Trade unions, industry, north, south, wherever you look at, it's about collaborating closely together. But if this environment may change, what are your expectations, Ms. Baron, to the next COP? We see that the sense for collaboration might be under stress. The trade cake is not growing, but it's more, if it's yours or mine, this is more sort of fighting. So it gets a lot harder, and the way we actually discuss and have confrontations on this gets harder. What is the influence on that on the next COP and the whole process of these COPs that are ahead of us?
So it's absolutely clear that we face difficult times and geopolitical tensions, but nevertheless it's essential to be here and to be at a COP, and that Europe is here and that the world is here, and that we keep on working and discussing and maybe having hard and heavy discussions, but still it's worthwhile to do it. And I do think that we need maybe to come to more concrete levels. So we saw that, or we do see it in the Climate Club, where there are at the moment over 40 members, that once you get to more concrete initiatives or industry initiatives and show that there are best practices and that there are business cases, then you can convince partners. And I think this is what we have to do. And it's possible, but we need those examples, showing that it's feasible and showing that it's possible. And I think this is what we all are responsible for, because business acts globally and reports globally, and we see strong movements, enormous developments in China. So I think the way is quite clear, and so and Europe especially has to stay together and to give us a clear signal.
So give it a positive spin for the future. And I think the fact that we did this section together unions and BDI is maybe a signal in itself how collaboration could work. And maybe this is one of the takeaways beyond all the content that working together is not only possible, but makes us all a lot more successful. Thank you very much. This was this session, and give applause to the last panel.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.